Lisa Morgan stood at Gate 12 of the Stellar Dawn passenger terminal, holding her first-class boarding pass between fingers that had once gripped the controls of a burning space station. The ticket had cost her 3 months of military pay, but after 5 years of service on the frontier worlds, she had decided to treat herself to something special. She was going home to Earth for the first time since the war ended, and she wanted to travel in comfort. The scars on the left side of her face caught the harsh terminal lighting, creating shadows that made some passengers look away when they passed her. Lisa had grown used to the stares over the past 2 years since the Battle of Kepler Station. The burn marks ran from her temple down to her collarbone, a reminder of the day everything changed. She touched them sometimes without thinking, the way other people might touch a lucky charm. The boarding line moved slowly as passengers showed their tickets to the flight crew. Lisa watched families with excited children talking about their vacation plans, business travelers checking their tablets one last time, and elderly couples holding hands as they prepared for what might be their last trip to see distant relatives. Everyone seemed happy and relaxed, the way people get when they are about to start a journey. When Lisa reached the front of the line, she handed her boarding pass to the young woman behind the counter. The flight attendant looked at the ticket, then at Lisa, then back at the ticket again. Her name tag read Karen White, and she had the kind of perfect smile that airlines trained their employees to wear. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but there seems to be a problem with your ticket," Karen said, her smile never wavering but her eyes avoiding Lisa's face. Lisa felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she got when sensors picked up unknown ships on the edge of scanner range. "What kind of problem?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Karen tapped something on her computer screen and shook her head. "The system shows that first class is completely full. I'm afraid you'll need to take a seat in economy class today." "That's not possible," Lisa said, pointing to her boarding pass. "I bought this ticket 3 weeks ago. It clearly says seat 2A, first class." The people behind Lisa in line began to shift impatiently, and she could hear whispers starting among the other passengers. Karen's smile became more forced as she continued typing on her keyboard. "I understand your frustration, ma'am, but sometimes these computer errors happen. I can offer you a complimentary upgrade to Premium Economy, which has extra legroom and better meals." Lisa looked past Karen toward the first-class boarding area where she could see several empty seats through the aircraft door. "I can see empty seats from here. I paid for first class and that's where I intend to sit." The whispers around her grew louder, and Lisa became aware that some passengers were pulling out their phones to record what was happening. She had dealt with difficult situations before, but those had involved enemy ships and hostile aliens, not airline employees who seemed determined to move her away from other passengers. Karen called over another flight attendant, an older man, named Robert, who wore the same practiced smile. He looked at Lisa's ticket and then at her face, his expression showing the same uncomfortable recognition that Karen had displayed. "Ma'am, I think what my colleague is trying to explain is that we want all our passengers to be comfortable during their flight," Robert said in a tone that suggested he was being reasonable. "Sometimes when passengers have visible injuries or scars, it can make other travelers feel uneasy, especially during meal service." The words hit Lisa like a physical blow. She had commanded a rescue ship during the worst battle humanity had ever fought. She had pulled 300 civilians from a burning space station while enemy fire tore through the hull around her. She had held a damaged airlock closed with her bare hands while evacuation ships escaped to safety. And now she was being told that her scars made people uncomfortable during meal service. "Are you refusing to honor my ticket because of my appearance?" Lisa asked, her military training keeping her voice calm even though anger was building inside her chest. "We're not refusing anything," Karen said quickly. "We're simply trying to accommodate all our passengers' needs. I'm sure you understand that in first class people expect a certain atmosphere." More passengers had gathered behind Lisa now, and she could hear fragments of their conversations. Someone mentioned that they didn't want to sit near someone who looked like that. Another person said it might be contagious. A child asked his mother what was wrong with the lady's face, and the mother hushed him while pulling him away. Lisa turned to look at the growing crowd and saw a mixture of expressions. Some people seemed genuinely uncomfortable, as if her scars were something they might catch. Others looked embarrassed but said nothing, A few were recording everything with their phones, probably planning to post it on social media later. "I served in the military for 5 years," Lisa said, addressing not just Karen and Robert but the entire crowd of passengers. "These scars are from the Battle of Kepler Station, where I helped evacuate civilians from an alien attack. I purchased a first-class ticket with money I earned protecting the colonies that many of you probably live on." Karen and Robert exchanged glances, and Lisa could see that they were not impressed by her explanation. If anything, they seemed more determined to move her away from the first-class section. "Ma'am, we appreciate your service," Robert said in the same tone people used when they wanted to end a conversation quickly. "But airline policy is very clear about maintaining the comfort and safety of all passengers. If you don't accept the premium economy upgrade, we'll have to ask security to escort you from the aircraft." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a damaged engine. Lisa looked around at the faces surrounding her and realized that most of these people supported the airline's position. They wanted her moved away from them, wanted her hidden in the back of the aircraft where they wouldn't have to look at the evidence of what she had sacrificed for their safety. She thought about the 300 people she had saved at Kepler Station, how grateful they had been when she pulled them from the wreckage. She wondered if any of them would recognize her now, or if they would also ask to have her moved to a different section of the aircraft. The terminal intercom crackled to life, announcing that boarding for the Stellar Dawn would begin shortly. Lisa stood at the gate, surrounded by people who saw her scars as something ugly and disturbing, holding a first-class ticket that apparently meant nothing when weighed against other passengers' comfort. Lisa took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders the way she had been taught in officer training. She had faced down alien warships and hostile boarding parties, and she was not about to be intimidated by airline employees who thought her scars were bad for business. "I will not be moving to economy class," she said clearly, making sure her voice carried to the passengers who were recording the confrontation. "I have a valid first-class ticket that I purchased with my own money. I am not sick, I am not dangerous, and I am not going anywhere." Karen's smile finally cracked, revealing the irritation underneath. "Ma'am, you need to understand that other passengers have rights too. They paid for a premium experience, and part of that experience is a certain level of comfort and atmosphere." "What exactly about my appearance threatens their comfort?" Lisa asked, turning slightly so that the worst of her scars was visible to the crowd. "Are you saying that people who have been injured in service to their colonies should be segregated from other travelers?" The question made several passengers shift uncomfortably, but Lisa noticed that none of them spoke up in her defense. A businessman in an expensive suit muttered something about paying good money not to deal with this kind of drama. A woman with perfectly styled hair pulled her teenage daughter closer, as if Lisa's scars might somehow transfer to them. Robert stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "This isn't about discrimination, ma'am. This is about maintaining standards that our first-class passengers expect. If someone is visibly injured or disfigured, it can be disturbing to other travelers, especially during meal service or when people are trying to rest." "So you admit that you're removing me because of my scars," Lisa said, her military training helping her stay focused on the facts even as anger burned in her chest. "We're offering you an upgrade to premium economy," Karen said defensively. "Most people would be grateful for that kind of accommodation." Lisa looked around at the crowd of passengers and saw a mixture of expressions. Some seemed genuinely uncomfortable with her presence, while others appeared embarrassed by the situation but unwilling to get involved. A few people were still recording everything, probably planning to share it online later. "I noticed that you're not asking any of the other first-class passengers to move," Lisa said, gesturing toward a man with a large bandage on his forehead and another passenger who walked with a visible limp. "Is it only certain types of injuries that threaten the premium atmosphere you're trying to maintain?" The question caught Karen off guard, and she stammered something about those being temporary injuries rather than permanent disfigurement. The distinction made several passengers wince, and Lisa could see that even some of her critics were beginning to realize how the airline's position sounded when stated so bluntly. An elderly man near the back of the crowd cleared his throat and spoke up. Perhaps the young lady could wear something to cover her face during the flight. That way everyone would be more comfortable. The suggestion was offered as a reasonable compromise, but it hit Lisa like a slap. She had spent 2 years learning to live with her scars, learning not to hide from the world because of how other people reacted to her appearance. The idea of covering her face like some kind of monster was more insulting than anything Karen or Robert had said. "I will not be covering my face," Lisa said firmly. "These scars are not something I should be ashamed of. I got them while saving lives, and I'm not going to hide them because they make other people uncomfortable." The situation was escalating, and Lisa could see that the airline crew was getting desperate to resolve it. Karen whispered something to Robert, who nodded and reached for his radio. Within minutes, 2 security guards appeared at the gate, their uniforms crisp and their expressions professionally neutral. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to either accept the airline's offer of alternative seating or leave the aircraft," one of the guards said in a tone that suggested he had dealt with difficult passengers many times before. Lisa felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came before combat, but she forced herself to remain calm. Getting arrested would not help her situation, and it would certainly not change anyone's mind about how they treated veterans with visible injuries. "I'm not causing any disturbance," she said, keeping her hands visible and her voice steady. "I have a valid ticket for first class, and I'm simply trying to board the aircraft that I paid to travel on." The security guards exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the situation they had been called to handle. Lisa could see that they were trying to figure out whether she was actually breaking any rules, or if the airline was simply trying to avoid dealing with passenger complaints. "The airline has the right to refuse service to anyone who disrupts the comfort of other passengers," the second guard said, though he sounded less certain than his partner. "How exactly am I disrupting anyone's comfort?" Lisa asked. "I haven't raised my voice. I haven't threatened anyone, and I haven't done anything except try to take the seat that I paid for." More passengers had gathered to watch the confrontation, and Lisa could hear snippets of their conversations. Some supported the airline's position, saying that first-class passengers shouldn't have to deal with unpleasant sights during their expensive flights. Others seemed uncomfortable with the situation but unwilling to get involved in what they saw as someone else's problem. A few people were beginning to recognize something familiar about Lisa's uniform and bearing, though none of them could quite place where they had seen her before. Her military posture and calm demeanor under pressure marked her as someone with serious training, but that only seemed to make some passengers more nervous rather than more sympathetic. Karen was talking urgently into her headset, probably calling for a supervisor, or trying to figure out how to resolve the situation without creating a bigger public relations problem. The passengers who were recording everything would probably post their videos online within hours, and the airline clearly wanted to avoid negative publicity. Lisa stood her ground, surrounded by people who saw her scars as something disturbing and shameful, facing security guards who had been called to remove her from an aircraft she had paid to board. She thought about the 300 civilians she had saved at Kepler Station and wondered if any of them would stand up for her now, or if they would also prefer to have her hidden away where her sacrifices wouldn't remind them of the price that others had paid for their safety. The crowd at Gate 12 had grown larger as word spread through the terminal about the confrontation taking place. Passengers from other flights had stopped to watch, some recording with their phones while others simply stared at the unusual scene. The tension was thick enough that even children seemed to sense something important was happening. Security was preparing to escort Lisa away from the gate when the aircraft door opened and a man in a pilot's uniform stepped into the boarding area. Captain Jake Sullivan had been running through his pre-flight checklist when one of the cabin crew mentioned there was some kind of disturbance at the gate involving a passenger who refused to move to economy class. Jake was tired of dealing with entitled passengers who thought their frequent flyer status gave them the right to cause problems for his crew. He had planned to simply tell security to handle the situation and get back to preparing for takeoff. But something about the way the flight attendant described the passenger made him curious enough to take a look for himself. The moment he stepped into the terminal, Jake could see that this was not a typical passenger dispute. The woman at the center of the confrontation stood with perfect military posture, her hands at her sides and her expression calm despite being surrounded by security guards and angry airline employees. Even from across the crowded gate area, he could tell she had serious military training. Jake moved closer, noting the way the woman held herself under pressure. She was not shouting or making threats like most difficult passengers. Instead, she was speaking quietly and calmly, answering questions and presenting her boarding pass with the kind of steady composure that came from real combat experience. As he got closer, Jake could see the scars on the left side of her face and neck. They were not the kind of injuries that came from accidents or medical procedures. These were burn marks with a very specific pattern, the kind that came from explosive decompression and plasma fire in a space environment. Jake had seen similar injuries during his own military service, though never quite as extensive as what this woman had survived. The scars told a story of someone who had been very close to serious danger and had somehow lived through it. They were the kind of marks that came from staying behind when everyone else was evacuating, from choosing to face the fire instead of running away from it. The pilot pushed through the crowd of passengers, ignoring their protests as he made his way toward the confrontation. As he got closer, he could hear fragments of the argument between the woman and the airline crew. "I purchased a first-class ticket with my own money," the woman was saying, in a voice that carried clear authority, despite its calm tone. "I am not sick, I am not dangerous, and I have every right to take the seat that I paid for." Karen White, the flight attendant who had started the whole mess, was becoming increasingly flustered as she tried to explain the airline's position. "Ma'am, we're just trying to maintain the comfort of all our passengers. Some people find visible injuries disturbing, especially during meal service." Jake felt his jaw tighten as he heard those words. He had served with plenty of people who had been injured in the line of duty, and the idea that their sacrifices should be hidden away to protect other people's delicate sensibilities made his blood pressure rise. The woman in question turned slightly as she responded to something one of the security guards said, and Jake got his first clear look at her face. The burn scars were extensive, running from her temple down to her collarbone in a pattern that spoke of tremendous heat and pressure. But it was not the scars that caught his attention. It was her eyes. Jake had seen those eyes before, in news, reports, and military briefings. He had seen them in the footage from Kepler Station, where a single officer had stayed behind to coordinate the evacuation of 300 civilians while alien weapons tore the station apart around her. He had seen them in the medal ceremony where she had received the Colonial Cross for extraordinary heroism under fire. This was Lieutenant Commander Lisa Morgan, the angel of Kepler Station, standing in his boarding area while his crew tried to kick her off the aircraft because her scars made other passengers uncomfortable. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized what was happening. The woman who had saved 300 lives, including his own younger brother, was being treated like a pariah because she bore the visible evidence of her heroism. The pilot stepped forward, his captain's uniform causing the crowd to part in front of him. The security guards noticed his approach and stepped aside, recognizing his authority over anything that happened on his aircraft. "What seems to be the problem here?" Jake asked in the calm voice he used when dealing with air traffic control during emergencies. Karen immediately launched into her explanation about computer errors and passenger comfort, but Jake was not listening to her words. He was studying Lisa Morgan, noting the way she stood at attention despite the stress of the situation, the way her eyes remained focused and alert even when surrounded by hostile faces. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass?" Jake asked, addressing Lisa directly rather than going through the airline crew. Lisa handed over her ticket without comment, and Jake examined it carefully. "First class, seat 2A, purchased 3 weeks ago and paid for in full. There was absolutely nothing wrong with the documentation." "And may I ask your name and unit?" Jake said, his voice taking on the formal tone used when addressing fellow military. "Personnel. Lieutenant Commander Lisa Morgan, Colonial Defense Force, recently assigned to Frontier Patrol duty," Lisa replied automatically, her military training taking over. The name hit Jake like a physical blow. He had been right. This was the woman who had saved his brother's life, who had held a damaged airlock closed with her bare hands while Pete and hundreds of other civilians escaped to safety. She was standing in his terminal being harassed by his crew because her heroism had left visible marks on her face. Jake looked around at the crowd of passengers who had gathered to watch the spectacle, at the airline employees who were trying to remove a decorated war hero from his aircraft, at the security guards who had been called to escort away the woman who had prevented the worst civilian disaster in colonial history. Something cold and hard settled in his chest as he realized that none of these people had any idea who they were dealing with. They saw only the scars, not the story behind them. They saw only something that made them uncomfortable, not the courage that had created those marks. Jake turned to face the crowd, his captain's uniform giving him authority that even the security guards respected. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of command presence that came from years of making life and death decisions in emergency situations. Ladies and gentlemen, I think there are a few things you need to know about the passenger you're trying to remove from my aircraft. Jake Sullivan had commanded passenger aircraft through some of the worst weather in colonial space, had brought damaged ships safely home through asteroid fields and solar storms. But he had never felt the kind of cold anger that was building in his chest as he looked at the crowd of passengers who wanted Lisa Morgan removed from his aircraft. He stepped closer to Lisa, noting the way she maintained perfect military composure, even while surrounded by people who saw her as something ugly and disturbing. The scars on her face told a story that none of these civilians would ever understand, a story of courage and sacrifice that had saved more lives than most of them could imagine. "Lieutenant Commander Morgan," Jake said formally, his voice carrying across the crowded gate area. "I need to ask you something, and I want everyone here to listen to your answer." Lisa turned to face him fully, and Jake could see recognition beginning to dawn in her eyes. She had noticed his pilot's wings and was probably wondering why a civilian aircraft captain was addressing her by rank and asking questions in front of a crowd of passengers. 2 years ago, during the Battle of Kepler Station, were you the officer who coordinated the civilian evacuation while the station was under enemy attack? Jake asked, his voice loud enough for everyone in the boarding area to hear. "Yes, sir," Lisa replied without hesitation. "I was the evacuation coordinator for Kepler Station during the alien assault." A murmur went through the crowd as passengers began to realize they were listening to something more significant than a simple airline dispute. Some of them were starting to remember news reports from 2 years ago, fragmentary memories of the worst battle humanity had fought against alien forces. Jake continued his questioning, his voice taking on the tone of an official military briefing. "How many civilians were evacuated from Kepler Station before it was destroyed?" 307, sir," Lisa answered immediately. "All civilian personnel were successfully evacuated before the station's hull was breached." "And what was the condition of the station during the evacuation?" Lisa's voice remained steady as she answered, but Jake could see the memories reflected in her eyes. "The station was under heavy enemy fire, sir. Multiple hull breaches, life support failure in sections 7 through 12, and total power loss to the evacuation bays. The main docking ring had been severed by plasma weapons." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word as they began to understand that they were listening to an account of real combat, not some abstract military exercise. Jake could see recognition dawning on several faces as people remembered the news coverage from Kepler Station. "How did you manage the evacuation under those conditions?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer from the official reports he had read. "I remained at the emergency control station to manually operate the evacuation systems after the main computers failed," Lisa said. "When the primary airlock was damaged, I held it closed manually while the last evacuation ships departed." Jake let that information sink in for a moment, watching the faces of the passengers who had wanted this woman removed from their sight. Holding an airlock closed manually during explosive decompression was something that should have been impossible. A feat of strength and determination that had cost Lisa most of the skin on her left side. "Lieutenant Commander Morgan," Jake said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "My younger brother, Pete Sullivan, was one of the civilian engineers evacuated from Kepler Station. According to his report, you personally pulled him from a collapsed section of the engineering deck while plasma fire was burning through the hull around you." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. This was not some abstract military hero from news reports. This was the woman who had saved the life of their pilot's brother, who had risked everything to make sure that families stayed together and that colonies did not lose their most essential personnel. Lisa's expression softened slightly as she processed what Jake had told her. "I remember Pete Sullivan, young engineer about 25 years old trapped under debris in Section 9. Is he all right?" "He's alive and well thanks to you," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion that he was not trying to hide. "He's now the chief engineer at Europa Station, with a wife and 2 children who exist because you chose to stay behind and make sure everyone got out safely." The silence in the boarding area was complete now, broken only by the distant sounds of other flights preparing for departure. Passengers who had been recording the confrontation were still holding their phones, but now they were capturing something very different from what they had expected. Jake turned to address the crowd directly, his captain's uniform giving him the authority to command their attention. "The woman you want removed from first class is Lieutenant Commander Lisa Morgan, holder of the Colonial Cross for extraordinary heroism. She is known throughout the military as the Angel of Kepler Station because she saved 307 civilian lives during the worst battle humanity has ever fought." He gestured toward Lisa's scars, the marks that had caused so much discomfort among the passengers. "Those scars that you find so disturbing are the price she paid for making sure that 300 families did not lose their loved ones. She got them by holding a damaged airlock closed with her bare hands while the people she was saving escaped to safety." The businessman who had earlier complained about paying good money not to deal with drama was now staring at Lisa with a mixture of shame and awe. The woman who had pulled her daughter away was looking at her own hands, probably wondering if she would have the courage to do what Lisa had done. "While you were sleeping safely in your beds 2 years ago," Jake continued, his voice carrying the kind of moral authority that came from absolute certainty, "Lieutenant Commander Morgan was standing in a burning space station, breathing poisoned air and feeling her skin burn away because she refused to leave until every single civilian was safe." Karen White, the flight attendant who had started the whole confrontation, was now pale and silent, probably realizing that her career might not survive the publicity that this incident was about to generate. Robert, her supervisor, was looking at his shoes as if he could disappear into the floor. Jake was not finished. He had spent 2 years wondering how he could ever thank the woman who had saved his brother's life, and now she was standing in front of him being treated like a criminal because her heroism had left visible marks. "Every single person in this terminal owes their freedom to people like Lieutenant Commander Morgan," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the boarding area. "The colonies you live on, the ships you travel in, the safety you take for granted, all of it exists because there are people willing to sacrifice everything to protect it." He looked around at the faces of the passengers, seeing shame and embarrassment replacing the earlier discomfort and disgust. "And when one of those heroes tries to take a vacation, when she tries to travel home after years of service on the frontier, you want her hidden away in the back of the aircraft because her scars remind you that freedom sometimes comes with a price." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Jake could see that several passengers were beginning to understand the full magnitude of what they had been trying to do. They had been attempting to exile a war hero because her visible sacrifices made them uncomfortable during their leisure travel. Jake was not finished with his impromptu history lesson. The crowd of passengers stood in stunned silence as he continued to explain exactly who they had been trying to remove from their sight, and Lisa could see recognition dawning on more faces as people began to remember the news coverage from 2 years ago. "The Battle of Kepler Station was not just another military engagement," Jake said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through those dark days. "It was the moment when humanity came closest to losing everything we had built in colonial space. The aliens had broken through our defensive lines and were targeting civilian infrastructure across 3 star systems." He gestured toward Lisa, who stood quietly listening to her own story being told to people who had wanted her hidden away. Kepler Station was the central hub for colonial administration, communication, and supply distribution. If it had been destroyed with all personnel aboard, 3 entire worlds would have been cut off from essential resources and left defenseless against follow-up attacks. Several passengers were now looking at their phones, probably searching for information about the Battle of Kepler Station and finding news articles they had forgotten or ignored when they were first published. Jake could see the moment when some of them began to realize the full scope of what Lisa had prevented. When the alien attack began, standard protocol called for immediate evacuation of all civilian personnel, Jake continued. But the enemy had specifically targeted the evacuation systems using plasma weapons to destroy the main docking ring and disable the automated safety systems that were supposed to guide people to safety. A woman near the back of the crowd gasped as she found a news article on her phone, probably one of the reports that had called Lisa the Angel of Kepler Station. Jake noticed that several other passengers were now actively searching for information, and the mood in the boarding area was shifting from hostility to something that looked like shame. Lieutenant Commander Morgan was not supposed to be on evacuation duty that day, Jake said, looking directly at Lisa as he spoke. She was scheduled to pilot a reconnaissance mission to gather intelligence on enemy ship movements. But when the attack began and the evacuation systems failed, she volunteered to stay behind and coordinate the rescue efforts manually. Lisa remained at attention, her military training keeping her composed, even as Jake recounted the most terrifying day of her life. She could see that some of the passengers were beginning to understand what had really happened at Kepler Station, though she doubted they could truly comprehend what it had been like to stand in a burning space station while everything fell apart around her. The evacuation took 14 hours, Jake continued, his voice growing quieter as he described events that still gave him nightmares. 14 hours of constant enemy fire, with hull breaches opening faster than the emergency systems could seal them. 14 hours of breathing toxic smoke and feeling the station shake apart while 300 civilians waited for someone to save them. He turned to address the crowd more directly, making sure that everyone could hear what he was saying. For 14 hours, Lieutenant Commander Morgan stood at an emergency control station that should have been automated, manually guiding evacuation. Ships through debris fields and plasma fire because the computers had been destroyed by enemy weapons. The businessman who had earlier complained about expensive flights was now staring at Lisa with an expression that looked like awe mixed with guilt. Several other passengers were openly reading news articles about the Battle of Kepler Station, and Jake could see the moment when they began to understand the magnitude of what they were witnessing. When the final evacuation ship was ready to depart, the primary airlock had been damaged by weapons fire and would not seal properly, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion as he described the moment that had changed his family's life forever. The ship could not leave safely with the airlock open, but there was no time to repair it properly. Jake paused, looking around at the faces of people who minutes earlier had wanted Lisa removed from their sight. Lieutenant Commander Morgan made the decision to hold the airlock closed manually while the ship departed. She stood there with her bare hands against twisted metal and explosive decompression, feeling her skin burn away from plasma residue, because she was not going to let a single civilian die on her watch. The silence in the boarding area was now complete, broken only by the quiet sounds of passengers scrolling through news articles on their phones. Some of them had found video, footage from the evacuation ships, shaky recordings that showed a lone figure standing at an airlock while fire burned around her. The evacuation ship my brother was on barely made it to safety, Jake continued, his voice breaking slightly as he spoke about events that still haunted his dreams. When they reached the rescue fleet, the medical team said it was impossible, that anyone could have survived holding that airlock closed. The heat and pressure should have killed anyone who tried it. He looked directly at Lisa, whose scars were now visible to everyone in the boarding area as undeniable proof of what she had endured. But Lieutenant Commander Morgan did not just survive. She held that position for an additional 6 minutes after the evacuation ship departed, making sure that no other ships were trapped in the station before she finally made her way to the last escape pod. Several passengers were now crying as they read about the Battle of Kepler Station and began to understand what they had been witnessing. A teenage girl was showing her mother a video of the medal ceremony where Lisa had received the Colonial Cross, the highest honor that could be awarded for heroism in combat. When the rescue teams reached her escape pod, they found Lieutenant Commander Morgan unconscious from smoke inhalation and severe burns, but she was still clutching the station's final evacuation report, Jake said. Even while she was dying, her last thought was to make sure that the military command knew that every civilian had been saved. The elderly man who had earlier suggested that Lisa cover her face during the flight was now staring at his shoes, probably wondering how he could have been so wrong about someone whose courage had helped preserve the civilization he lived in. Jake turned to address Karen White and Robert, the airline employees who had started the whole confrontation by trying to remove Lisa from first class. Their faces were pale with the realization that they had just attempted to discriminate against one of the greatest heroes in colonial history. "This is the woman you wanted to hide in economy class because her scars might disturb other passengers," Jake said, his voice carrying absolute moral authority. "This is the person you thought should be ashamed of her appearance and grateful for an upgrade to premium economy." The flight crew stood silent, probably realizing that their careers might not survive the publicity that this incident was about to generate. Videos of the confrontation were already being uploaded to social media, and within hours the entire colonial network would know that an airline had tried to discriminate against the Angel of Kepler Station. Jake turned his attention to Karen White and Robert, his voice taking on the cold precision he used when dealing with air traffic control during emergencies. The two flight attendants stood frozen under his gaze, probably beginning to realize that they had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. "I want to understand the airline's policy regarding passengers with visible injuries," Jake said, his captain's uniform giving him absolute authority over anything that happened on his aircraft. "Are you telling me that Stellar Dawn routinely discriminates against military veterans who were wounded in service to the colonies?" Karen stammered something about passenger comfort and premium atmosphere, but her words sounded hollow and pathetic. After Jake's description of what Lisa had endured at Kepler Station, Robert tried to interrupt with explanations about computer errors and seating availability, but Jake silenced him with a look that could have frozen plasma. "Let me be very clear about something," Jake said, his voice carrying to every corner of the boarding area. "As captain of this aircraft, I have the authority to refuse service to any passenger who poses a threat to safety or order. I also have the authority to remove any crew member who fails to uphold the standards of professional conduct that this airline claims to represent." The threat was unmistakable, and Karen and Robert exchanged worried glances as they realized that their jobs were now in serious jeopardy. Several passengers were still recording everything, and the video footage of airline employees trying to discriminate against a war hero would probably be viral within hours. "Furthermore," Jake continued, his voice growing colder as he spoke, "I want to know exactly who made the decision to approach Lieutenant Commander Morgan about her seating assignment. Was this a spontaneous act of discrimination, or does Stellar Dawn have official policies that allow crew members to relocate passengers based on their physical appearance?" A supervisor named Patricia Chen had arrived during Jake's speech about the Battle of Kepler Station, summoned by increasingly frantic calls from the gate crew. She was a middle-aged woman with 20 years of airline experience, but she had never dealt with anything like the situation that was unfolding in front of her. "Captain Sullivan, I'm sure there's been some kind of misunderstanding," Patricia said, trying to project the kind of calm authority that airline supervisors used to diffuse difficult situations. "Our crew would never intentionally discriminate against military personnel." Jake turned to face her with the kind of expression he usually reserved for passengers who tried to bring dangerous items onto his aircraft. "Ma'am, I have personally witnessed your employees tell a decorated war hero that her appearance makes other passengers uncomfortable, and that she should be grateful for an upgrade to economy class. How exactly do you classify that as anything other than discrimination?" Patricia looked around at the crowd of passengers who were now openly hostile to the airline's position, at the phones recording every word of the conversation, at the war hero standing quietly in the middle of the controversy her crew had created. The public relations nightmare was getting worse by the minute. "Captain, I'm sure we can resolve this situation to everyone's satisfaction," she said, falling back on the standard corporate language used when airlines wanted to avoid admitting fault. "We can certainly offer Lieutenant Commander Morgan an upgrade to our premium suite, along with complimentary meal service and priority boarding on all future flights." The offer was clearly intended to make the problem go away quickly, but Jake was not interested in corporate damage control. He had spent 2 years wondering how he could thank the woman who had saved his brother's life, and he was not going to let her be bought off with airline perks. "The question is not what you can offer Lieutenant Commander Morgan now," Jake said, his voice cutting through Patricia's attempted diplomacy. "The question is how your airline treats military veterans as a matter of standard policy, and whether this incident represents isolated misconduct or systematic discrimination." Patricia realized that she was dealing with something far more serious than a typical passenger complaint. The captain was not just defending a difficult passenger. He was challenging the fundamental way that her airline treated people who had been injured in military service. "I can assure you that Stellar Dawn has the utmost respect for military personnel," she said, reciting the kind of corporate statement that airlines used in their advertising materials. "We would never intentionally discriminate against anyone based on injuries sustained in service to the colonies." Jake gestured toward Karen and Robert, who were still standing nearby, looking increasingly uncomfortable as the situation escalated beyond their ability to control. "Then how do you explain the actions of your crew members, who specifically told Lieutenant Commander Morgan that her scars make other passengers uncomfortable and that she should accept alternative seating to maintain the premium atmosphere of first class?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Patricia could see that there was no good way to answer it. Either her crew had acted against company policy, which meant they should be fired, or they had followed company policy, which meant the airline was guilty of systematic discrimination against wounded veterans. Several passengers were now approaching the confrontation, no longer content to simply watch from a distance. A businessman who had earlier supported the airline's position now looked ashamed as he addressed Patricia directly. "Ma'am, I think you need to understand that we're not talking about some random passenger complaint," he said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine remorse. "This woman saved hundreds of lives, including family members of people on this flight. The way your crew treated her is absolutely unacceptable." Other passengers began to voice similar sentiments, and Patricia could see that the mood in the boarding area had shifted completely. People who had originally supported removing Lisa from first class were now demanding that the airline apologize and take action against the employees who had created the situation. Jake was not finished applying pressure. As captain, he had the authority to delay or cancel the flight if he determined that crew misconduct threatened the safety or reputation of his aircraft, and he was prepared to use that authority if necessary. "I want to know what action Stellar Dawn intends to take regarding the crew members who created this situation," he said, his voice carrying the kind of command presence that came from years of making critical decisions under pressure. "I also want to know what steps the airline will take to ensure that military veterans are never again subjected to this kind of treatment." Patricia could see that she was trapped between the public relations disaster that was unfolding in real time and the need to support her employees, even when they had clearly made serious mistakes. The videos being recorded by passengers would probably be seen by millions of people within hours, and the colonial news networks would almost certainly pick up the story of an airline discriminating against a war hero. "Captain Sullivan, I can promise you that we will conduct a full investigation into this incident," she said, trying to buy time while she figured out how to minimize the damage to the airline's reputation. Jake's expression made it clear that promises of future investigations were not sufficient to address the immediate problem. "Ma'am, I'm not asking for investigations. I'm asking for immediate action to correct a clear case of discrimination against a military veteran who risked her life to protect the civilians that your airline serves." What happened next surprised everyone in the boarding area, including Lisa herself. The businessman who had earlier complained about paying good money not to deal with uncomfortable situations stepped forward and addressed the crowd of passengers directly. "I need to say something," he announced, his voice carrying across the boarding area with surprising authority. 20 minutes ago, I was one of the people who supported moving this lady to economy class because I thought her scars were unpleasant to look at during an expensive flight. He turned to face Lisa directly, his expression showing genuine remorse for his earlier attitude. "Ma'am, I want to apologize not just for my own ignorance, but for the fact that people like me exist. You saved lives while I've spent my career selling insurance policies, and I had the arrogance to think that your sacrifices were something I shouldn't have to see during my vacation." The admission was powerful because it was completely honest, and it seemed to give other passengers permission to acknowledge their own mistakes. A woman with perfectly styled hair who had earlier pulled her daughter away from Lisa now approached with tears in her eyes. "I am so ashamed of myself," she said, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I teach my daughter about heroes and courage, and then when I meet a real hero, I try to hide her away because she doesn't look like the pictures in storybooks." The teenage girl beside her looked up at Lisa with the kind of awe that young people reserved for their greatest heroes. "Are you really the angel of Kepler Station?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. "We studied about you in school, but I never thought I would actually meet you." Lisa felt something shift inside her chest as she realized that the hostile crowd was transforming into something very different. People who had wanted her removed from their sight were now approaching her with respect and admiration, finally seeing past her scars to the person underneath. An elderly veteran in a wheelchair rolled forward, his own service medals visible on his jacket. "Lieutenant Commander, I served in the Merchant Marine during the early colonial expansion. I want you to know that people like you are the reason people like me can sleep safely at night." The simple statement seemed to break down the last barriers that had separated Lisa from the other passengers. More people began to approach, some offering apologies for their earlier behavior, others simply wanting to shake hands with someone they had only heard about in news reports. Jake watched the transformation with satisfaction, but he was not finished with his mission to ensure that Lisa received the treatment she deserved. He turned to address the crowd as a whole, his captain's uniform giving him the authority to speak for everyone present. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we can all agree that Lieutenant Commander Morgan deserves better than the treatment she received from this airline's crew," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the boarding area. "But I think we can also do better than simply offering apologies after the fact." He gestured toward the first-class section of the aircraft, where several passengers had been preparing to board. "I'm upgrading Lieutenant Commander Morgan to the premium suite at no charge, and I'm personally guaranteeing that she receives the finest service we can provide during this flight." The announcement was met with spontaneous applause from the crowd, but Jake was not finished. He had an idea that would turn this incident from a public relations disaster into something positive that the airline could actually be proud of. "Furthermore," he continued, "I'm establishing a new policy for this aircraft. Any military veteran who presents valid identification will receive priority boarding and complimentary upgrades to the highest class of service available, regardless of their physical appearance or the nature of any injuries they may have sustained in service to the colonies." The proposal was unprecedented in commercial aviation, but the crowd responded with enthusiastic support. Passengers who had been recording the confrontation were now capturing something very different. A group of civilians rallying around one of their protectors and demanding that she be treated with the respect she had earned. Patricia Chen, the airline supervisor, realized that the situation had moved beyond damage control and into an opportunity for the airline to demonstrate real leadership on an important issue. The videos being recorded would still go viral, but now they would show Stellar Dawn taking positive action rather than simply trying to cover up discriminatory behavior. "Captain Sullivan, I think your proposal is excellent," she said, speaking loudly enough for the cameras to record her words. "I'm authorizing the immediate implementation of your veteran priority policy, and I'll be recommending to corporate headquarters that it be adopted fleet-wide." The announcement was met with more applause, and Lisa found herself surrounded by passengers who wanted to thank her personally for her service. Children asked for her autograph, adults shared stories of family members who had served in the military, and everyone seemed eager to make up for the way she had been treated when she first tried to board the aircraft. A young father with twin boys approached Lisa with obvious nervousness, but his words carried genuine emotion. "Ma'am, my brother was one of the engineers you saved at Kepler Station. He talks about you every time our family gets together, but he never told us you had been injured. I want my sons to meet the person who brought their uncle home safely." The children looked up at Lisa with the kind of pure admiration that came naturally to young people who had not yet learned to be uncomfortable with visible differences. They saw only a hero who had saved their uncle, not someone whose scars made other people uneasy. Jake made one final announcement as passengers began boarding the aircraft with a very different attitude than they had shown an hour earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want everyone to understand something important about the person who will be traveling with us today." He gestured toward Lisa, who was now surrounded by admirers rather than critics. "Lieutenant Commander Morgan represents the very best of humanity. She chose to risk everything to protect people she had never met, and she paid a price that most of us cannot imagine. When we honor people like her, we honor the courage and sacrifice that makes our civilization possible. The words seemed to capture exactly what everyone was feeling, as they watched Lisa being treated with the respect she had always deserved. The incident that had begun as discrimination had transformed into something that looked like a celebration of human courage and solidarity. As first-class passengers boarded the aircraft, several of them offered to give up their seats so that Lisa could have even more space and comfort during the flight. The gesture was unnecessary since Jake had already upgraded her to the premium suite, but it demonstrated how completely the attitude in the boarding area had changed. Lisa stood surrounded by people who now saw her as she truly was, not a woman, disfigured by war, but a guardian of humanity who deserved every honor that civilization could offer. The Stellar Dawn lifted off from the terminal with a very different atmosphere than anyone had expected when boarding began 3 hours earlier. Lisa found herself in the premium suite, a luxury cabin that she had never imagined experiencing. But more importantly, she was surrounded by people who finally understood who she really was. During the first hour of the flight, a steady stream of passengers made their way to her section of the aircraft. Some came to apologize for their earlier behavior. Others wanted to thank her for her service, and many simply wanted to meet the person they had only heard about in news reports and military history classes. A young mother with a baby approached, during the meal service, her expression showing nervous excitement. "Lieutenant Commander, I hope you don't mind me bothering you, but I wanted you to know that my husband is serving on a patrol ship near the frontier. Knowing that there are people like you out there protecting the colonies makes it easier for me to sleep at night while he's away." Lisa had never been comfortable with praise or recognition, but she was beginning to understand that her story meant something important to these people. They needed to know that there were guardians watching over the civilization they had built among the stars, and her visible scars were proof that those guardians were real. Jake visited her cabin during the flight, bringing coffee and the kind of relaxed conversation that developed between military personnel who had served in dangerous places. He told her about his brother Pete, who was now married with 2 children and working as the chief engineer at Europa Station. "Pete talks about you every time our family gets together," Jake said, settling into the chair across from Lisa as the ship cruised through hyperspace. "He says that watching you hold that airlock closed was the most incredible thing he's ever seen. He also says that he never properly thanked you for saving his life." Lisa sipped her coffee and looked out at the stars streaming past the viewport. "I was just doing my job. Any officer would have done the same thing in that situation." Jake shook his head with the kind of smile that older military personnel reserved for younger ones, who had not yet learned to accept their own heroism. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that's not true. Most officers would have followed evacuation protocol and left with the last group of civilians. You chose to stay behind because you couldn't bear the thought of losing a single life on your watch." The conversation was interrupted by a group of children who had convinced their parents to let them visit the premium cabin. They approached with the kind of nervous excitement that came from meeting someone famous, clutching drawings they had made during the flight. "Miss Angel," one of the children said, using the nickname that had stuck after the Battle of Kepler Station, "we made pictures of you being brave in space." The drawings were the kind that children created when they tried to capture something too complex for their artistic skills but perfectly clear in their imagination. They showed a figure in a spacesuit holding together pieces of a broken station while people escaped in small ships. The scars were not hidden or minimized. They were drawn as part of the story, evidence of courage rather than something to be ashamed of. Lisa felt tears building in her eyes as she looked at the drawings, understanding for the first time that her story had become part of the way children learned about courage and sacrifice. These young people saw her scars not as disfigurement, but as proof that real heroes existed in the world they were growing up in. "Thank you," she said to the children, her voice thick with emotion that she was not trying to hide. "These are the most beautiful pictures anyone has ever drawn of me." As the flight continued, Lisa found herself in conversations with passengers from every walk of life. A retired teacher wanted to know about life on the frontier worlds. A young engineer was fascinated by the technical challenges of holding a damaged airlock closed during explosive decompression. An elderly historian wanted to record her first-hand account of the Battle of Kepler Station for a museum archive. Each conversation helped Lisa understand something that had been missing from her life since the battle. She had spent 2 years thinking of her scars as something that marked her as different, as damaged, as someone who made other people uncomfortable. But these passengers saw them as evidence of strength, as proof that she had been willing to pay any price to protect others. During the final hour of the flight, Jake made an announcement over the ship's communication system. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we prepare for our approach to Earth, I want to share some news with you. The videos of today's incident at the terminal have been viewed by over 10 million people across the Colonial network." Lisa felt her stomach tighten as she imagined millions of people watching her being discriminated against by airline employees. But Jake's next words surprised her. "The response has been overwhelmingly positive," he continued. "People across the colonies are demanding that all transportation companies adopt policies to ensure that military veterans receive the respect and treatment they deserve." 3 other airlines have already announced similar programs, and the Colonial Senate is considering legislation to make veteran priority policies mandatory throughout the transportation industry. The announcement was met with applause throughout the aircraft, and Lisa realized that the incident that had begun as personal humiliation had become something larger. Her story was helping to change the way that society treated people who had been wounded in service to others. As the ship entered Earth's atmosphere, Lisa looked out at the blue and green world that she had not seen for 5 years. She was returning home not as someone marked by war, but as someone whose sacrifices had helped preserve the civilization that made worlds like Earth possible. Jake appeared at her cabin door as the ship touched down, wearing the kind of smile that came from a "Job well done, Lieutenant Commander. On behalf of Stellar Dawn Airlines and everyone aboard this aircraft, I want to thank you for your service and for giving us the opportunity to do the right thing today." Lisa stood and straightened her uniform, feeling something that she had not experienced since before the Battle of Kepler Station. For the first time in 2 years, she was not hiding from the world or apologizing for her appearance. She was standing proud as the person she had chosen to become when she decided that protecting others was worth any price. "Captain Sullivan," she said, offering him the kind of salute that one military professional gave to another, "thank you for reminding me who I really am." As Lisa walked off the aircraft, she was met by reporters and camera crews who wanted to interview the Angel of Kepler Station about her experience with airline discrimination. But she was also met by Pete Sullivan, Jake's younger brother, who had flown to Earth specifically to thank the woman who had saved his life. The scars on her face caught the camera lights as she spoke to the reporters, but now they seemed like badges of honor rather than marks of shame. She was no longer hiding from the world because of how she looked. She was standing in front of it, wearing her courage on her face for everyone to see. In the reflection of the terminal windows, Lisa saw not a damaged woman trying to travel in comfort, but what she had always been since the day she chose to stay behind at Kepler Station, a guardian of humanity who deserved every bit of respect that the galaxy could offer.